what we could do next time. And I was thinking that it would be great if we could kind of open things up a bit and get to interface with the people that are not exactly within transhumanism, but have something to add to the conversation.
I'm going to fire that one back at the gentleman there, because it sounds like a bit of a leading question. Have you got any thoughts on what you would like to have seen here that isn't being represented?
No, not particularly. It was just a leading question trying to explore the field a bit.
Question was there.
Natasha, do you want?
Oh, sorry, I was actually pointing further back in the room.
I rather like that. I don't know if the sound of my voice is loud anyway. I rather like that question because we have a diverse panel and all are transhumanists. I think Rachel is a transhumanist regardless of whether she has been involved in the movement for a long time. But yeah, as a designer, she's quite brilliant, and she's also a medical doctor, to name just a few of her expertise. But I want to take this to Max, and it's interesting because you have the quote-unquote father of transhumanism on the panel. So I'm going to ask you that question. How do you see this conference bearing up to the quality and the demeanor of transhumanism over the past, say, 20 years? How do you view this conference and the direction of the conference as far as representing a broad spectrum of the ideas as they've matured over the past, say, 2 decades?
Well, I'm not sure I can fairly answer that question, because since we're still in the morning sessions, so we haven't really finished it all through, so we're prejudging it too much. What I think would be something worth exploring for the future would be to bring in, especially in a 2-day event, bring in some critics of transhumanism, some people who really dislike these ideas, but have something interesting to say about why they dislike them, not just people who are going to rant and rave. It might be also interesting to explore a more structured process by which more people can get involved in the discussion. I know the Foresight Institute tried to do that, not maybe completely successfully, but there are ways of Anders was stressing the idea of collective intelligence, wisdom of the crowd, and so on. There should be some way of harnessing that, I think, in this kind of meeting, not for every session, but to have more voices in a structured manner, so it's not just doing questions right now, and to try to build some actual solutions to problems by getting many people's input. So I think those things would be worth exploring. But I think we have great roster of speakers. We started back with the extra conferences quite a few years ago, when these ideas seemed crazy to almost everybody. We just had a pretty small group of people who were interested in them. Now, I think we have far more people to draw upon. That also helps with the wisdom of crowds, because the crowd is much larger and more diverse. But I think getting people who are critical of these ideas and some structured wisdom would be a good idea for future events.
We're going to have some more radical ideas in the afternoon, so if people feel they haven't had anything mind-stretching enough, there's more to come.
There's a question, David, just by you. Gentleman right in front of you, with his hand up.
Thanks for 3 fascinating talks. It's very hard to say very much about the timescale of the subject that you're talking about, but if you were looking at this conference 10 years from now, what do you think you'll be saying about these subjects then?
Well, to start out, I would say, guess that in 10 years it's going to be very interesting to see where did we end up with the legal status of the cognition-enhancing drugs. That's going to be a kind of political issue over the next 10 years. Meanwhile, by that point, I think we're going to see a more mature internet, which I don't think we have any idea how it looks, but my kind of hand-waving about collective intelligence is going to be very much like somebody in the Victorian age saying, oh, the future is steam. And kind of it was. It was just that we went far beyond it.
There's a question in there. David, for a second right.
I need some cognitive enhancement, I think.
Can't be lazy. It's actually to Max, basically. You said that the singularity, in retrospect, you kind of got surges, S-curves, that kind of, there's a fast bit and then a kind of falling off again. Do you think this is partially linked to the singularity as a point you can't predict? You know, if you're before the singularity or the singularity, you kind of see an approaching thing, you can't predict what's going to happen, something unpredictable, and then in retrospect everyone's going, well, yes, that happened, we're still here, stuff has happened. I mean, in 1945, the explosion of the first atomic bomb, the entire world view changes overnight. But 10 years later, people have started to accept it. Life goes on, a massive sea change has occurred. So we have singularities all the time, but not all that. Just interesting.
Well, I think you're suggesting that after the singular event that we kind of look back at it and say, well, it wasn't such a big deal after all, not at all, but if you look at it from beforehand, it might seem that way. Whereas I was more looking at it from the, we're in the past essentially looking forward to the singularity, and I'm suggesting that even from that perspective, it wouldn't really be so singular as we've seen. You suggest one event that made big changes in the world, it didn't change everything. But I think, again, with these overlapping surges, that's what I'm suggesting is each event may be quite impressive, but it doesn't change everything. And they don't all happen at the same time, and they interact with each other in complex ways. So there will be things that we can't foresee at all. Totally new technologies, new ways of doing things, black swan events, and so on. But I don't think there'll be any single thing that you can really, it's very useful to describe as a singularity. I just worry that having this singularity concept is going to simplify our thinking too much into these kind of point-like events. The AI that changes everything, the single event that changes everything. And I think that simplifies things too much. In fact, what I think is one thing worth mentioning about all the talks this morning is, despite that historically a lot of critics of transhumanism have talked about us as being atomistic and focused on our brains and individually, we've all been talking about connecting, collective wisdom, and augmenting our intelligence by connecting with other people, and these communities of protocells working together and affecting the environmental effects of architecture and so on. And I've talked about how you have to take into account organizational factors and social factors and so on. So I think it's kind of interesting that all the speakers today have kind of, I think, shown that kind of criticism is wrong. We're not thinking in these very narrow, atomistic terms.
May I just add to that thing about the S-curves, because there is something very interesting about predicting an S-curve. Even if we know that the technology is going to have an S-curve, like I'm selling a new gadget and I know eventually people are going to level off, it's extremely hard at the start to predict how far it's going to go. And this is historically why predictions of how the spread of innovation is so bad. So just for fun, I tried to add fitting S-curves to Moore's law and tried to say, well, assuming it's eventually stopped, where would it stop? And I got a wonderful 22 orders of magnitude of uncertainty in that prediction. 22 orders of magnitude is simply amazing. It's very clear that even the most pessimistic one are still going to change the world quite a lot. But the upper levels are simply amazing. And that uncertainty itself is probably a reason to aim a lot of intelligence and thinking about, well, what do we do in the different scenarios? We actually need to handle a lot of uncertainty and an environment that's going to be extremely complex when these things happen.
Thank you. There's a question there. Just before that, is there anyone upstairs? I realise we're focusing down here, but if there's any question, right, okay, after this question, another gentleman upstairs.
Okay, it's a question about fundamental limits. I think the sort of common theme here is accelerating change in terms of knowledge, really. And certainly that has happened throughout a lot of history, certainly this century. But it's also been accompanied by exponential population growth and exponential use of energy. And I'd argue that those three are probably very interrelated. However, although we might be able to continue using exponential energy through nuclear power, for example, there are some fundamental limits, like, for example, the amount of crude oil, the amount of copper, the amount of tungsten, the amount of surface area available for growing crops, which will limit the population. So those fundamental limits, how do you think they might affect accelerating change, just to everyone?
Well, I think those limits could actually be seen as motivations to proceed toward the future that lots of people here foresee. New sources of energy. There are some problems that you cannot overcome. Okay, like the amount of space on this planet, which is an argument for space colonization, etc. Whether that will happen in our current form or in a post-human form further down the road is a different story. But limits is what we as transhumanists don't like. Limits is what we're trying to overcome, and we're trying to overcome them through technology. So I think that's the way they are going to be overcome, if they are going to be.
I think also I agree with Fabio that limits, constraints can actually be quite liberating.